The afternoon sun fell on Red Rock like the hammer of some wrathful god, pitiless and absolute. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the main street, turning the false-fronted buildings into wavering mirages. Dust hung suspended in the air, fine as flour coating the tongues of men and horses alike. The town baked under the assault, its inhabitants seeking whatever shade they could find, moving slowly, conserving strength against the relentless assault of another summer day on the high plains. Caroline Meyer stood in the middle of that inferno, 8 months heavy with child watching her life scatter into the dirt. Her trunk had been thrown from the boarding house steps with such violence that the latches had burst, spilling her meager possessions across the rutted street. Undergarments, a worn shawl, a tintype of her mother, all of it exposed to the eyes of strangers who looked on with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "You will not stay under my roof another hour, do you hear?" The saloon owner, a thick-necked brute named Bixby, stood at the top of the steps with a double-barreled shotgun cradled in his arms. His face was flushed brick red, whether from anger or the heat Caroline could not say. "I will not harbor a runaway bride carrying some other man's bastard. Get out of my sight before I lose what little patience I have left." Caroline wanted to speak, to explain that she had nowhere to go, no money, no family, that the child she carried was innocent of whatever sins they were laying at her feet. But the words would not come. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked and bleeding, and the effort of standing upright in her condition took all the strength she had. She bent slowly, painfully, to gather her scattered belongings, and as she did, a sharp contraction seized her lower back. The pain was sudden and vicious, forcing a gasp from her lips. She straightened too quickly, vision swimming, and staggered. The crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation parted slightly, forming a loose circle around her misery. She could feel their eyes on her, like physical weight, judging, condemning, finding her guilty of crimes she barely understood. A woman whispered something to her companion, and both laughed behind their hands. A man spat tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. A freight wagon came barreling down the main street, the driver shouting curses at his team of oxen. The wheels, iron-rimmed and massive, missed Caroline by perhaps 6 inches. She felt the rush of air as they passed, felt the spray of grit and pebbles against her legs. She stumbled backward, both hands flying to her swollen belly, and felt the baby kick hard in protest, as if it too sensed the danger pressing in from all sides. That was when Bixby raised the shotgun. He did not aim it directly at Caroline. He was not quite that far gone, but the barrel swung in her general direction, and the message was unmistakable. Several men along the boardwalk reached for their revolvers, uncertain whether to intervene or simply watch the drama play itself out to whatever bloody conclusion awaited. The street balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong word or movement away from violence. A horse appeared from the side alley, cutting through the space between Caroline and the raised shotgun with the precision of a cavalry maneuver. The rider was Apache, unmistakable in his bearing and dress. He wore a fringed buckskin shirt darkened with sweat, and his long black hair was bound back with a beaded headband worked in red and white patterns. His face was lean and hard, carved by wind and sun and years of hardship into something that looked more like weathered stone than flesh. His eyes were the color of flint, cold and unreadable. He did not speak. He did not draw a weapon. He simply heeled his horse forward, placing himself and his mount directly in the line of fire. Bixby's finger jerked on the trigger, whether by accident or intent, Caroline would never know. The shotgun roared, the double charge of buckshot tearing through the air where Caroline had been standing a moment before. The window of the telegraph office exploded inward with a crash of glass shards raining down onto the boardwalk like deadly hail. A woman screamed. Horses reared and fought their reins. Hands went to holsters all along the street. For one terrible suspended moment, it seemed certain that Red Rock would erupt into the kind of violence that left bodies bleeding in the dust and widows weeping behind closed doors. The Apache rider did not flinch. He extended his hand toward Caroline, palm open, waiting. Caroline looked up at him, through eyes streaming with tears and dust. She saw nothing in his face that spoke of pity or kindness, nothing soft or reassuring. What she saw was a grim determination, a refusal to look away from injustice, even when it would have been safer and easier to do so. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had chosen to intervene. But she knew with absolute certainty that if she did not take his hand, she would die in this street, and her child with her. She reached up and gripped his forearm. His hand closed around hers strong and calloused the hand of a man who had spent his life working with weapons and rope and hard labor. He pulled her to her feet in one smooth motion, then turned to face the crowd. The silence stretched, brittle and dangerous. "Take her, then," Bixby finally snarled, lowering the shotgun. His voice shook with impotent rage. "Take her and be damned. But do not come crying to me when she brings you nothing but trouble. That woman is promised to Krause's foreman. You are stealing property, Indian, and the law will not forget it." The Apache rider did not answer. He dismounted with fluid grace and began gathering Caroline's scattered belongings, moving quickly and efficiently. He stuffed clothing and small items back into the broken trunk, then lashed the entire thing to the back of his saddle with leather cord. The crowd muttered and shifted, but no one moved to stop him. Caroline stood trembling in the street, one hand pressed to her belly, feeling the baby kick and turn restlessly inside her. "You are taking on a heap of trouble, Indian," someone called from the saloon porch. "That woman is contracted labor. Krause owns her debt. The law will come for you before sundown." The rider swung back into the saddle and offered Caroline his hand again. She hesitated for only a moment, then gripped his forearm and allowed him to pull her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the hard muscle beneath the buckskin, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The horse moved forward at a walk, then a trot, carrying them out of Red Rock along the wagon road that led south toward the open prairie. Behind them, the town shimmered in the heat, already fading into the haze like something half-remembered, half-dreamed. Caroline did not look back. She pressed her cheek against the rider's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm of the horse's gait, feeling the sun beat down on her head and shoulders. She said nothing. The rider said nothing. The only sounds were the steady thud of hooves on packed earth and the creak of leather. They rode for perhaps half an hour before Caroline finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words nearly lost in the noise of their passage. "You did not have to do that. You put yourself in danger for a stranger." The rider was silent for a long moment. For a long, When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as if he did not use it often. "I know what it is to stand alone against a mob. I know what it is to face death and have no one willing to step between you and the bullet. I could not watch it happen again." "Again?" Caroline asked, but the rider did not answer. They rode on in silence. The sun sank lower as they traveled, painting the western sky in shades of crimson and gold. Long shadows stretched across the prairie, turning every rock and scrub bush into something strange and otherworldly. The heat began to ease, though the air remained thick and oppressive. They crossed a narrow plank bridge over the Red Rock River, the boards groaning under the combined weight of horse and riders. The water below ran shallow and sluggish, barely enough to wet the stones of the riverbed. A sudden gust of wind swept across the bridge, strong enough to make the structure shudder beneath them. Caroline felt herself tipping sideways, balance compromised by the weight of her belly and the awkwardness of riding behind the saddle. Panic flared bright in her chest. The rider's hand shot out, clamping around her elbow with controlled strength, steadying her until the gust passed. He released her as soon as the danger was over, without comment or acknowledgement, as if such things were simply part of the business of survival. They left the river behind and climbed a gentle slope into more broken country. Juniper and stunted pine dotted the landscape, clinging to life in the thin soil. The trail wound through a basin where prairie grass grew thick and tall, then climbed toward a sandstone bluff that rose against the darkening sky like the broken spine of some ancient beast. At the base of the bluff, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods, stood a small cabin constructed of rough-hewn logs. The rider reined in his horse and dismounted, then reached up to help Caroline down. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, whether from fear or exhaustion or the lingering effects of the contraction, she could not say. She stood in the yard, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and looked around. A spring seeped from the base of the sandstone bluff, clear water bubbling up from deep beneath the earth and forming a small stream that wound through a carefully tended patch of corn and beans before disappearing into the dry earth beyond. The corn stood tall and green, the ears just beginning to swell. Beyond the garden, the prairie stretched away into the distance, empty and vast, broken only by the dark shapes of distant mesas. The rider untied her trunk and carried it up onto the narrow porch that ran the length of the cabin. He pushed open the door, set the trunk just inside, then stepped back and gestured for her to enter. Caroline hesitated on the threshold, suddenly uncertain. She did not know this man. She did not know what he expected of her, what price he might demand for his protection. But she had no other choice. She stepped inside. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 15 feet on each side. A narrow bed stood against one wall, covered with a blanket woven in geometric patterns of red, black, and white. A rough table and 2 stools occupied the center of the space. Along the opposite wall hung an array of weapons, a short double-barreled coach gun on wooden pegs, several long rifles, a bow and quiver of arrows, and a collection of steel traps. Bundles of dried herbs and strips of cured meat dangled from the rafters, filling the air with a scent of sage and smoke. The floor was packed, earth-swept clean. A small iron stove crouched in one corner, its pipe rising through the roof. It was spare and utilitarian, the dwelling of a man who lived alone and expected nothing from the world but what he could take with his own 2 hands. There was no softness here, no comfort beyond what was strictly necessary for survival. Yet it felt safer than anywhere Caroline had been in months. She turned to find the rider standing in the doorway, watching her with those unreadable flint-colored eyes. "My name is Caroline Meyer," she said, her voice hoarse. "I came from Germany 6 months ago on a ship so crowded and filthy that 3 women died on the voyage. I was contracted as a mail-order bride, though I did not understand what that truly meant until I arrived. I have no money, no family, no one who will speak for me. I do not know why you saved me, but I am grateful beyond words." The rider nodded slowly. "My name is Takelma. You may stay here until the child is born. After that, we will decide what comes next." "Why?" Caroline asked. "Why would you risk yourself for someone you do not know?" Takelma was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, as if he were testing each word before releasing it. 3 years ago, cavalry and ranchers raided my band near Buffalo Gap. They came in the night, burning everything, shooting anyone who tried to flee. My younger brother Nietzsche was 16 years old. I watched him die in the dust with a bullet in his chest, and I could do nothing to save him. The white men blamed renegade Apaches and took the land afterward, claiming it was too dangerous for my people to remain. He paused, his jaw tightening. When I saw you in that street, surrounded by men who saw you as less than human, I saw Nietzsche's face. I saw the same terror, the same helplessness. I could not stand by and watch it happen again. I would not. Caroline felt tears sting her eyes. "I am so sorry." "It was not your doing," Takelma said. But it was men like the ones who own this territory who did it. They hide behind laws and contracts and the badges they pin to their chests, but underneath they are no different from the raiders who killed my brother. They take what they want and destroy anyone who stands in their way. He stepped back outside, and Caroline heard him moving around the cabin, tending to the horse drawing water from the spring. She sank onto one of the stools, pressing her hands to her face, and allowed herself a moment of weakness. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, all the fear and grief and exhaustion of the past months pouring out of her in a flood she could no longer contain. When Takelma returned, he found her still sitting there, her face wet with tears. He set a tin cup of water on the table in front of her without comment, then moved to the stove to kindle a fire. Caroline drank the water slowly, feeling it ease her parched throat, and watched him work. His movements were precise and economical, wasting no effort, speaking of long years of practice and self-sufficiency. That night, dry lightning flickered along the northern horizon, great silent flashes that illuminated the mesa in stark white relief. Takelma stepped outside several times to scan for signs of grass fire, his rifle always within reach. Each time he returned, he glanced at Caroline where she lay on the bed, curled on her side, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She twisted in her sleep, fighting cramps and nightmares, her face drawn with pain, even in unconsciousness. Takelma sat on the floor near the door, rifle across his knees, and watched the lightning dance. He had lived in this place for 3 years, ever since the raids that scattered his band and left him with nothing but grief and a cold hunger for something that looked like justice. He had built this cabin with his own hands, felled the trees, notched the logs, raised the walls. He had dug the garden, planted the corn, learned to live alone with his memories and his anger. He survived now by trapping and guiding, taking work from the white men in Red Rock when they needed someone who could track game or read sign. They tolerated him because he was useful, but they did not trust him, would never truly accept him. He had learned to read the faces of men who wanted him gone, learned to move quietly and keep his weapons close. He had not expected to bring a pregnant white woman into his home. He had not expected to care whether she lived or died. But when he saw her standing in that street belly, swollen with new life, surrounded by men who saw her as property to be bought and sold, he had seen more than Nietzsche's face. He had seen the face of everything the white men had taken from his people: dignity, autonomy, the simple right to exist without permission. And he had acted without thinking, driven by something deeper than reason or self-preservation. Now she was here asleep in his bed, and he did not know what the morning would bring. But he knew with certainty that the men from Red Rock would come. They would not allow this challenge to their authority to stand unanswered. The only question was when and how many of them there would be. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky a pale wash of blue above the bluff. Takelma was already awake, crouched by the spring filling a leather water bag, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He straightened slowly, water dripping from his hands, and turned toward the trail. His body tensed instinct and experience, warning him that violence was riding toward him on the morning wind. 4 riders emerged from the scrub, moving at a steady trot. Takelma recognized the lead rider immediately, Sheriff Mateo Conti, called Jackrabbit Jim by the men in the saloons for his quickness with a gun. Mateo was a lean man with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing, a professional lawman who wore his authority like a well-fitted coat. Behind him rode Rudolf Kraus, the cattle baron, whose brand marked half the livestock in the territory. Kraus was thick-shouldered and brutal-looking, with a face like old leather and eyes that held all the warmth of a winter dawn. 2 ranch hands flanked them, both armed with rifles slung across their saddles. Takelma walked back to the cabin and set the water bag on the porch rail. Caroline appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn eyes wide with barely controlled fear. She pressed one hand to the doorframe to steady herself. Takelma shook his head slightly, a gesture that meant stay inside, but she did not move. She stood frozen, watching the riders approach her other hand, pressed protectively over her belly. The riders reined in at the edge of the yard, and Mateo dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He walked forward slowly, his hand nowhere near his revolver, the picture of calm reason. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and held it up so that both Takelma and Caroline could see the official seal stamped at the bottom in red wax. "This here is a legal contract." Mateo said, his voice flat and businesslike, carefully devoid of emotion. "Mail-order bride agreement signed and stamped by the Silver Spur Settlement Agency. According to the terms herein, the woman you are harboring is the contracted bride of Mr. Krause's foreman, one Hans Gruber, and owes the sum of $240 in travel expenses, lodging, and administrative fees. She absconded before fulfilling the terms of her contract. Under territorial law, that makes her an indentured servant in breach of obligation. By harboring her, you are interfering with a legal arrangement and concealing stolen property." Takelma did not move. He looked past Mateo to Rudolf Krause, who sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the entire territory existed to serve his interests. Krause's face was hard and cold, and there was something in his eyes that Takelma recognized, the look of a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation or remorse. "She is not property," Takelma said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the words. Mateo sighed, the sound of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "The law says different, Takelma. I do not make the rules. I just enforce them. You know that." One of the ranch hands, a thick-necked man with a scar running from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, swung out of his saddle and stepped up onto the porch. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver, and his intentions were written plainly on his brutal face. "You got no say in this matter, Indian. The law says she belongs to Mr. Krause's foreman. You hand her over peaceful-like, or we take her. And you too, if you are fool enough to interfere further." Mateo raised a hand, but his voice carried an edge of warning now. "Takelma, do not make this harder than it needs to be. If you refuse to surrender the woman, I will have no choice but to treat you as a kidnapper and an accomplice to contract fraud. Under territorial law, that is a hanging offense. And beyond that, you are squatting on land that is under legal dispute. Mr. Krause has filed a claim with the land office asserting prior use rights. You got no legal standing here. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Caroline stepped out onto the porch, her hands gripping the rail so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her voice was low and hoarse, but it carried across the yard with the force of desperation. "If I go back with them, I will not survive it. They will work me until the child is born, and then they will take the baby and sell me to the mines, or to another man in another town. I heard them talking in the boarding house. I heard Bixby and Krause's foreman making plans. That is what they do with women like me, women who arrive with no family, no money, no one to speak for them. We are merchandise, Sheriff. Nothing more." Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed one hand to her belly as a contraction seized her. She gasped, doubling over, her other hand clutching the rail. Takelma moved without conscious thought. He stepped to her side, steadying her with one hand on her shoulder, and with the other he reached up and lifted the coach gun from its pegs on the wall. He did not point it at anyone. He simply held it, both barrels loaded, hammers down. The message was unmistakable. It was, Mateo's eyes narrowed, and his hand drifted toward his revolver. The two ranch hands tensed, ready to draw. The air in the yard grew thick with the promise of violence, with the smell of sweat and leather and gun oil. The morning seemed to hold its breath. "Do not be a fool, Takelma," Mateo said quietly. "You cannot win this fight. Even if you get one or two of us, the rest will kill you. And then what happens to the woman? She goes back to Krause anyway, and you die for nothing. Maybe so, Takelma said, his voice flat and final. But I can make it cost you more than you want to pay. I guarantee that at least 2 of you will not ride away from here, maybe 3. Are you willing to die for Krause's contract, Sheriff? Are your deputies? The scarred ranch hand shifted his weight, hand tightening on his revolver. I will put a bullet in you right now, you red savage. Enough. Rudolf Krause's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He urged his horse forward a few steps, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold and measured the voice of a man who was accustomed to giving orders and seeing them obeyed. You have until sundown to bring the woman to Town Indian. If you do not, I will return with 20 men and enough firepower to burn this shanty to the ground with you in it. You think about that while you still have time to think. He turned his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. The 2 ranch hands followed, casting dark looks back over their shoulders. Mateo remained for a moment longer, his face unreadable. He looked at Caroline, and something in his expression might have been pity or regret or simple weariness. I am sorry, Mateo said quietly. But the law is the law, and men like Krause own the law in this territory. If you run, he will hunt you down. If you fight, he will kill you. There is no good ending here. He mounted his horse and rode after the others, leaving Takelma and Caroline alone in the yard. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast silence of the prairie. Caroline straightened slowly, one hand still pressed to her belly, her face slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. Can you ride? Takelma asked. Caroline nodded, though her legs were shaking. I do not have a choice, do I? No, Takelma said. You do not. Pack only what you can carry easily. We leave in 5 minutes. He moved quickly and efficiently, gathering supplies, dried meat, corn cakes, filled water bags, ammunition for the rifles, and the coach gun. He saddled the horse, checking the cinches twice, then helped Caroline into the saddle. She bit back a gasp of pain as another contraction rippled through her, but she settled herself as best she could, gripping the saddle horn with both hands. Takelma swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. He snapped them sharply, and the horse lunged forward just as the first gunshots rang out from the trail. Bullets kicked up dust around the horse's hooves, and Caroline heard the sharp crack of a rifle from the rocks above the cabin. Krause's men had circled back, intending to take them by surprise. Takelma bent low over Caroline's back, shielding her with his own body as much as possible. He drove the horse toward the narrow trail that led up into Whirlwind Pass, away from the open prairie where they would be easy targets. More shots followed, bullets snapping through the air like angry hornets. One tore through the brim of Takelma's hat. Another splintered the stock of the rifle slung across his back. They reached the cover of the rocks and plunged into the narrow defile, the horse's hooves clattering on stone. Behind them, the gunfire continued for another minute, then fell silent. But Takelma knew they would be followed. Krause would not let this insult stand. The only question was how much time they had before the pursuit began in earnest. They rode hard through the morning, the sun climbing higher and hotter with every passing mile. The trail to Whirlwind Pass was treacherous, winding through broken country, where the rocks threw back the heat until it felt like riding through an oven. Takelma's water bags grew lighter, and Caroline's lips cracked and bled, despite his efforts to ration their supply. When they reached the creek that should have been running full, this time of year, they found it reduced to a muddy trickle. A new dam had been thrown across the upper canyon, crude but effective rocks and timber, lashed together with rope and sealed with packed mud. Most of the water was being diverted into a wooden flume that ran south toward Krause's grazing land. Takelma dismounted and led the horse down into the creek bed. He filled one of the water bags from the shallow pool, straining the water through a piece of cloth to remove the worst of the sediment, then held it to Caroline's lips. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and soaking the collar of her dress. When she finished, Takelma drank sparingly, just enough to wet his throat, then poured the rest over the horse's muzzle. "This is deliberate." Caroline said, her voice rough. "They are trying to drive you off the land by cutting off your water." "Yes," Takelma said. He was staring up at the dam, his face hard as granite. "Kraus has been doing this for months, building dams and diverting water from Apache lands. He wants to force my people to move north, where the hunting is poor and the water scarce. He wants the valley for his cattle and his ambitions." A rifle shot cracked from the high ground, above the sound echoing off the canyon walls. The bullet struck a rock near the horse's front hoof, sending sharp fragments flying. The horse reared, eyes rolling white with fear, and Caroline cried out as she nearly lost her seat. Takelma grabbed the reins and yanked the animal back under control, then pulled Caroline from the saddle and dragged her behind the low creek bank. More shots followed, fired from multiple positions. Caroline could see 3 men on the rim of the canyon, dark shapes against the bright sky, and she knew there were probably more that she could not see. They were not trying to hit anyone yet, just keeping them pinned down, waiting for reinforcements or for night to fall. Takelma pulled his rifle from its scabbard and returned fire the sharp crack of his shots, forcing the men on the rim to duck behind cover. But he knew it was only delaying the inevitable. They needed to move to find better cover, but Caroline could barely walk, let alone climb through this broken country. He forced the horse up the creek bed, using the shallow banks and overhanging rocks as cover. Water splashed around the animal's legs, soaking through his boots. Caroline clung to the saddle, trying to keep her weight centered, but her belly pressed hard against the saddle horn with every step, and she could feel the baby moving restlessly, disturbed by the rough treatment. When the horse stumbled on a submerged stone, Caroline pitched sideways with a scream. Takelma's arms shot out, catching her around the waist, hauling her back before she could fall. For a moment they were pressed together, her back against his chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. She could feel the rapid hammer of his heart, feel the tremor in his muscles from exertion and adrenaline. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the violence that surrounded it, and Takelma felt it against his forearm, a small, insistent reminder of the life he was fighting to protect. "Hold on," he said, his voice rough with strain. "Just hold on to me." They found refuge in a narrow side canyon, a dry arroyo that cut away from the main watercourse. Takelma dismounted and pulled Caroline down after him, then led the horse deeper into the shadows, where they could not be seen from above. The gunfire stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was the rasp of their breathing and the nervous shifting of the horse. Then a voice called out from the rocks above, speaking in Apache. The words were harsh and angry, and Caroline did not understand them, but she heard the accusation in the tone the fury barely held in check. "My cousin," Takelma said quietly, his face going hard. "Nidis, this is going to be difficult." 3 figures appeared on the rim of the arroyo, an older Apache man flanked by 2 younger hunters. Nidis was perhaps 10 years older than Takelma, his face carved by wind and hardship into something that might have been made from the stone around them. He carried a rifle, and his eyes were cold as he looked down at his cousin. He spoke again in Apache, a long string of words that rose and fell like the wind across the prairie. Takelma responded in the same language, his voice equally harsh. The argument went back and forth, growing more heated with each exchange. Finally, Nidis switched to English, his words sharp and precise. "Why do you risk everything for a white woman, cousin? Our people go thirsty because of Kraus's dams, and you waste your strength protecting her. Have you forgotten who you are? Have you forgotten that it was white men who killed Nietzsche, who scattered our band, who drove us from the good lands into these rocks and dust? I have not forgotten. Takelma said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I will never forget. But Nietzsche would not want me to stand by and watch an innocent woman die. You know that as well as I do. She is not innocent, Natus said. She is part of the same kind of power that keeps our people under its boot. Her people came to this land and took it from us, killed our families, penned us up like animals. Why should we sacrifice ourselves for her? Because she has done nothing to us, Takelma shot back. Because she is as much a victim of their system as we are. Look at her, Natus. She is alone, pregnant with no one to protect her. They were going to work her to death or sell her like livestock. Is that the kind of thing we should ignore? Is that what we have become? Natus stared down at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. The two hunters beside him shifted their grip on their rifles, and Caroline felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. If Natus decided that Takelma was a threat to his people, they would not leave this canyon alive. She is not our responsibility, Natus said finally. She is not our blood, not our concern. If you want to throw your life away for her, that is your choice. But do not expect us to follow you into death. I am not asking you to follow me, Takelma said. I am asking you to remember what we are supposed to be. We are supposed to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That is what being Apache means. Or has Kraus taken that from us too? Natus's jaw tightened, and for a moment Caroline thought he might raise his rifle. But then he spat into the dust and turned away, his two companions following. As they disappeared over the rim, one of the younger hunters looked back, and his expression was complex anger and resentment, yes, but also something that might have been respect or understanding. Takelma stood motionless until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. Then he released a long breath and turned to Caroline, who was trembling against the canyon wall. Will they betray us? She asked. No, Takelma said. Natus is angry, but he will not betray his own blood. But he will not help us either. We are on our own. He helped Caroline back onto the horse, and they continued deeper into the pass, away from Kraus's men and the eyes of his cousin. As they rode, Caroline found herself thinking about what Takelma had said, that protecting those who could not protect themselves was what being Apache meant. She thought about the men in Red Rock who called themselves civilized, but saw nothing wrong with buying and selling women. She thought about Rudolph Kraus and his cold eyes, about Sheriff Matteo Conti and his careful adherence to laws that served only the powerful. And she thought about the man riding behind her who had risked everything to save a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Whatever happened next, she knew she had been saved by a better man than any she had met in the so-called civilized world. They reached Takelma's cabin under cover of darkness, slipping past the places where he knew Kraus's men would be watching. The cabin was dark and cold when they arrived, and Caroline collapsed onto the bed while Takelma saw to the horse and secured the doors and windows. When he finally came inside, he found her curled on her side, crying silently. He lit a lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. "You are safe for now," he said. Caroline looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "Am I, or are we just waiting for them to come and kill us?" "They will come," Takelma said, "but we will be ready when they do." Over the following days, Takelma transformed the cabin into a fortress. He strung a line of tin cans on wire near the spring, creating a makeshift alarm system that would rattle if anyone approached from that direction. He dug a shallow firing trench behind the corn patch, deep enough to offer some protection, but not so deep that it would slow their movement if they needed to retreat quickly. He checked and rechecked his weapons, cleaned and oiled them, counted his ammunition, and found it dangerously low. Caroline watched him work and felt her guilt deepen with each passing hour. This man had saved her life, and now he was preparing to die for her. It was not right. It was not fair. But she did not know what else to do. One afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly and the heat inside the cabin became almost unbearable, Caroline forced herself to stand and walk outside. She found Takelma sitting on the porch steps, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibility he was carrying. "Teach me to shoot," she said. Takelma raised an eyebrow. "You have never handled a firearm before." "No," Caroline admitted. "But if they come for us, I want to be able to defend myself. I do not want to be helpless while you fight for both of us." Takelma studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He stood and fetched the coach gun from inside the cabin, then led her out to the edge of the yard. He handed her the weapon, and she nearly dropped it, surprised by its weight. "It is heavier than I expected," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It has to be," Takelma explained. "The weight helps absorb the recoil. A lighter gun would break your shoulder when you fired it. Now plant your feet shoulder-width apart, like this." He demonstrated with his own feet. "Do not lean forward or the kick will knock you flat on your back. Keep your weight slightly back on your heels." Caroline adjusted her stance, trying to find her balance despite the awkward weight of her belly. Takelma stood off to one side, watching critically. When she leaned too far forward, he nudged her boot back with his own. When her elbows sagged, he tapped them gently upward. "Keep your thumb clear of the hammers," he warned. "If you do not, the recoil will tear it off. Do you see that large rock out there, the one with the white stripe running through it? I want you to aim for the center of that rock and fire both barrels at once." Caroline lifted the gun, settling the stock against her shoulder the way she had seen men do. She took a deep breath to steady herself, aimed as carefully as she could, and pulled both triggers simultaneously. The explosion was deafening, a physical assault on her ears that left them ringing. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like the kick of a mule, and she staggered backward, nearly losing her footing. Takelma's hand flashed out, catching her upper arm and steadying her. For a moment, his fingers brushed against the curve of her belly, and the baby inside kicked hard, a sharp jab that both of them felt. Caroline gasped, and Takelma jerked his hand away, as if he had touched something forbidden. They stood there for a moment, neither speaking, both acutely aware of the unexpected intimacy of the contact. Caroline could feel heat rising in her cheeks, and she looked away, embarrassed and confused by her own reaction. "You will have a bruise tomorrow," Takelma said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "But you did not drop the weapon. That is the most important thing." "I will do it again," Caroline said, her jaw set with determination. And she did. Every day, sometimes twice a day, until her hands stopped shaking and the recoil became something she could anticipate and absorb. She learned to plant her feet properly, to keep her elbows tight, to breathe through the roar and the smoke. Takelma never praised her outright, but she saw the small nod of approval when she put both loads into the center of the white-striped rock without flinching. Inside the cabin, Caroline worked her own transformation. She reorganized the limited space to make it more defensible, hanging sackcloth over the windows, to break sight lines, make it harder for anyone outside to track their movements. She lashed a sturdy railing along the porch, using rope and spare timber, giving herself something solid to grip as her balance grew increasingly precarious. She taught Takelma tricks she had learned on the immigrant ship about keeping food stores elevated and covered, about purifying questionable water, about staying clean in conditions where cleanliness seemed impossible. Once, when a coal rolled from the stove and started a small fire beneath a chair, Caroline kicked it out with her heel before Takelma even noticed. She spent the rest of the evening limping, her foot blistered and painful, but she refused to complain or draw attention to her injury. One evening, as they sat at the rough table eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Caroline asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. What was he like, your brother Nietzsche? Takelma was silent for so long that Caroline thought he was not going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and distant, as if he were pulling the words from some deep well of memory. He was younger than me by 6 years. Quick to laugh, quick to anger, full of energy and life. He wanted to be a warrior, wanted to earn his place among the men of our band. He practiced with his bow every day, hunted rabbits and prairie dogs to feed the camp. He was brave, perhaps too brave. When the raiders came, he ran toward them instead of away, trying to protect the women and children who were fleeing. They shot him down like a dog in the street. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Caroline saw the raw grief in his face. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I am so sorry," she said. "No one should have to watch their family die like that. The men who killed him wore the brand of Rudolf Krauss." Takelma continued, his voice hardening. "I saw it on their horses, their saddles, even on some of their clothing. But when I tried to tell the soldiers, they laughed at me. They said I was a liar, that it was renegade Apaches who had attacked us, and we had brought it on ourselves. Krauss claimed the land where we had been camped, said it was too dangerous to allow Apaches to remain so close to his cattle. The judge signed the order, and that was the end of it." "That is why you helped me," Caroline said softly. "Because you saw your brother in me. Someone helpless, someone about to be destroyed by men who face no consequences for their cruelty." "Yes," Takelma said, "and because I could not bear to fail again. I failed Nietzsche. I will not fail you." Caroline felt tears streaming down her face. "You did not fail your brother. You could not have saved him, but you can honor his memory by being the kind of man he would have been proud to call brother. And you are. You are that man." Takelma looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something soften in his expression, a crack in the wall he had built around his grief and anger. He turned his hand over beneath hers and gripped her fingers tightly. "I am afraid," he said quietly. "I am afraid that when they come, and they will come, I will not be strong enough to protect you. That you and the child will die because I was not good enough, not fast enough, not smart enough." "Then we will die together," Caroline said fiercely. "But we will die fighting, and they will remember us. They will remember that we did not go quietly into their neat categories and their legal contracts. We will make them pay for every inch of ground they take." Takelma's grip on her hand tightened, and they sat like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other in the gathering darkness. Meanwhile, in Red Rock, events were moving forward with the inexorable momentum of a boulder rolling downhill. Dr. Joseph Hale, a struggling physician with a conscience that would not be silenced, learned from the town judge that an official eviction order had been drafted. The order would transfer ownership of Indian Gulch to Rudolf Krauss under a territorial development clause, ostensibly to make way for a railway spur that would never be built. Joseph was a slight man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that he was constantly adjusting when nervous, which was most of the time. But beneath his unassuming exterior burned a core of stubborn decency that refused to bend to expediency or self-interest. When he learned what was being planned, he knew he had to warn Takelma. He rode out to the cabin late one afternoon, ostensibly making a house call to check on Caroline's health. In truth, he came to deliver a warning. "They are going to use the law as a weapon," Joseph said, standing in the cabin with his hat clutched in his hands. He glanced nervously at Caroline, who sat on the bed watching him, then back at Takelma. "The judge has signed an eviction order transferring this land to Kraus. They will call you a squatter, claim you have no legal right to be here, and take it by force if necessary. You have perhaps a week before they come to enforce it. Maybe less. How much less? Takelma asked. I do not know exactly. But there is something else. Joseph pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, his hands shaking slightly. I have been asking questions around town, trying to understand what is really happening with these mail-order bride contracts. A woman who works at the boarding house, a cleaning woman named Sarah, told me that Bixby keeps a detailed ledger locked in his trunk. It records all the women he has brought in and where they were sent when their contracted grooms rejected them. She says there are dozens of names in that book, maybe more. Can you get it? Caroline asked, sitting forward. Joseph shook his head. Not without being caught. Bixby is paranoid about that trunk. He keeps it locked and the key on a chain around his neck. But there is someone else who might be able to help. Lisette Moreau, the French schoolteacher who boards at the same house. Bixby trusts her because she is educated and refined, everything he wishes he could be. If anyone can get into that trunk, it is Lisette. Will she do it? Takelma asked. I will ask her, Joseph said. She has a good heart, and she does not like what is happening to women like Caroline. I think she will help if she understands what is at stake. Joseph left shortly after promising to do what he could. As they watched him ride away, Caroline felt a small flicker of hope ignite in her chest. If they could get that ledger, if they could prove what Kraus and the judge were doing, they might have a chance to turn the law against them, instead of the other way around. That night, Lisette Moreau waited until the boarding house fell silent, then crept down the hallway to Bixby's room with a set of hairpins concealed in her hand. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone in the house could hear it. She had never done anything like this before, had never broken a law or deliberately deceived anyone. But she had seen the women who came and went from the boarding house, had heard them crying in the night, had watched them loaded into wagons like cargo and sent away to destinations that Bixby described with casual cruelty. The lock on Bixby's door was simple, designed to keep out casual intruders rather than determined ones. Lisette worked at it with trembling fingers until she heard the soft click of the mechanism giving way. She pushed the door open slowly, wincing at every creak of the hinges, and slipped inside. The trunk sat at the foot of Bixby's bed, large and iron-bound. The lock was more substantial than the one on the door, but Lisette had come prepared. She worked at it for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, her fingers cramping and her back aching from bending over in the darkness. Finally, blessedly, the lock clicked open. She lifted the lid and found the ledger immediately, a thick book bound in cracked brown leather. She opened it and began to read. By the light of a candle, she had brought her stomach turning with each entry. Names of women, countries of origin, amounts, owed destinations when contracted grooms rejected them. Caroline's name was there, along with a notation, if foreman refuses, send to Silver Spur Mine. Below Caroline's entry were dozens of others. Some were marked, returned, not compliant. One was marked, deceased, natural causes. Though Lisette suspected there was nothing natural about the death. She found a pencil and several sheets of paper in her pocket and began copying entries as quickly as she dared, her handwriting shaky but legible. She was halfway through the second page when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart stopped. She blew out the candle and pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. The footsteps paused outside the door. She heard the doorknob rattle. Then a voice called from downstairs the night cook, asking something about the morning's breakfast preparations. The footsteps moved away, descending the stairs. Lisette released her breath in a long, shaking exhale. She forced herself to wait a full minute, then relit the candle and finished copying the last few crucial entries. At the bottom of one page, she found something that made her blood run cold. A rough sketch of a brand, a crooked double R, with a short horizontal bar beneath it. Next to the sketch was a notation in different handwriting. Buffalo Gap payment confirmed. Judge's share 15%. Lisette copied the sketch and the notation, then carefully closed the ledger and locked the trunk. She slipped out of the room and back to her own quarters, the copied pages hidden inside her bodice. She did not sleep that night. The next day, she passed the pages to Dr. Hale, who studied them with growing horror and fury. He brought them to Takelma that evening, spreading them out on the cabin table under the light of the lamp. "This is buying and selling women." Joseph said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Slavery in all but name. They are buying and selling women like livestock, falsifying debts using the courts to enforce their crimes. If we can get this to the territorial authorities, they will have to act." Takelma studied the pages, his face carved from stone. Then his eyes fell on the sketch of the brand, and his breath caught. Caroline saw his reaction and leaned forward. "What is it?" she asked. Takelma's finger hovered over the sketch, trembling slightly. "This brand. I have seen it before. The night the raiders killed Nietzsche, some of their horses carried this brand. I could not prove it at the time, had no evidence, but I knew. I knew in my bones that Kraus was behind the attack." He looked up at Joseph. "Can you compare the handwriting in this ledger to the judge's official documents?" Joseph adjusted his spectacles and bent over the pages, studying them carefully. "I think so. I have access to some of the court records from my work as the county physician. If the handwriting matches, it will prove the judge is part of this scheme." "Do it," Takelma said. "And be careful. If they discover what you are doing, they will kill you without hesitation." Joseph left, and Takelma sat staring at the sketch of the brand for a long time. Caroline watched him, saw the battle being waged behind his eyes, the desire for vengeance warring with the knowledge that revenge alone would not save them. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I am thinking that if we can prove Kraus and the judge are behind the raids and the trade in women, we might be able to turn the town against them," Takelma said. "It is a desperate gamble, but it is the only chance we have. The people of Red Rock may not care about what happens to Apaches, but they will care if they discover their judge, and their biggest cattle baron are murderers and slavers." 2 nights later, armed with Joseph's confirmation that the judge's handwriting matched entries in the ledger, Takelma decided he needed more evidence, something concrete and undeniable, that would force even the most corrupt territorial officials to act. He would slip into Red Rock after dark and break into the judge's office behind the telegraph station, looking for more documents that connected Kraus to the raids. Caroline begged him not to go, argued that it was too dangerous, that they already had enough evidence. But Takelma was adamant. "We need enough proof that they cannot ignore it or explain it away. We need to bury them so deep they can never claw their way back out." He rode out just after midnight, keeping to the shadows and the dry washes where his horse would leave no tracks. He reached Red Rock and left his mount tied in a grove of cottonwoods outside town, and then made his way through the back alleys on foot. He never made it to the judge's office. The judge's? One of Kraus's men was waiting between the stacked crates behind the telegraph building, a knife in his hand and murder in his eyes. The man lunged without warning, the blade flashing in the moonlight. Takelma threw himself backward, but the knife caught him across the ribs, a shallow cut that burned like fire and sent blood streaming down his side. The fight was brutal and desperate. Both men grappling in the narrow space between buildings. Takelma could not draw his gun without giving his attacker an opening to gut him. They fought in near silence, grunting with effort, the only sound the scuff of boots on packed dirt and the rasp of hard breathing. The knife flashed again, and Takelma caught the man's wrist, twisting hard. Bone cracked, and the knife fell. Takelma smashed the man's head into the brick wall once, twice, 3 times. The man went limp and slid to the ground. Takelma stood swaying for a moment, blood soaking through his shirt, then staggered away into the darkness. He made it back to his horse through sheer force of will, pulled himself into the saddle, and rode for the cabin. He arrived just before dawn, barely conscious, and almost fell from his horse. Caroline heard him and rushed out, taking one look at the blood-soaked shirt and the pallor of his face. She helped him inside and onto the bed, then fetched water and clean cloth. As she worked to clean and bind the wound, her hands were steady, but her voice shook. "You should not have gone. You could have been killed. If you had died, what would I have done? What would the baby have done?" "I had to try," Takelma said through gritted teeth. The wound was shallow but painful, every breath sending fresh fire through his ribs. "We need more than one ledger to convince the territorial governor." "You are the proof," Caroline said fiercely, pressing the bandage hard enough to make him wince. "You are still alive, and so am I. That is all the proof I need that you are worth more than all of them put together. Do not throw your life away, trying to convince people who do not want to be convinced." Takelma looked at her, saw the tears she was trying to hold back, saw the fierce determination in her eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 3 years he had been living with one foot already in the grave, convinced that his life had ended the night Nietzsche died. But now, looking at this woman, who had somehow become more important to him than his own survival, he realized he wanted to live. He wanted to see the child born, wanted to watch it grow, wanted to build something that would outlast the hate and the violence. "I am afraid," he said quietly. "I am afraid that I cannot protect you, that I will fail you the way I failed Nietzsche." Caroline finished tying off the bandage, then sat back and looked at him. "You did not fail your brother. You were there when he died. You honored his memory by building a life here. And you saved me when no one else would. That is not failure, Takelma. That is courage." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and for a long moment they stayed like that, drawing strength and comfort from the contact. When she pulled back, she smiled, though tears were streaming down her face. "Rest now," she said. "We will face whatever comes together." Takelma nodded and closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest. Over the next several days, Takelma's wound began to heal, though he moved stiffly, and every deep breath still brought pain. But there was no time for proper convalescence. Rudolf Krauss, frustrated by their continued defiance and the failure of his men to capture Caroline, changed tactics. If he could not take them by force immediately, he would starve them out. Within a week, Krauss's men raised the diversion dam higher, sealing it more completely, and fenced off more of the valley. The spring at Indian Gulch slowed to a trickle, then to nothing more than damp mud. The corn began to wilt, the leaves curling inward. The horse grew gaunt, its ribs showing stark beneath its hide. Caroline's ankles and feet swelled until she could barely walk. Climbing the porch steps became an ordeal that left her gasping and clutching the rail Takelma had built. She could feel the baby dropping lower, preparing for birth, and she knew they were running out of time in more ways than one. Takelma watched the spring die and knew they faced a stark choice: stay and die of thirst, or go up the canyon and destroy the dam. It was dangerous. Krauss would have men guarding it, but doing nothing meant certain death. He made the decision on a morning when the sun rose blood red over the bluff, staining the eastern sky the color of violence. They would ride up the canyon and cripple the dam. Let the water flow again. With luck, they would buy themselves enough time for Caroline to give birth and for help to arrive. Without luck, they would die trying. He saddled the horse, and helped Caroline mount, though every movement clearly pained her. The trail into the canyon was steep and treacherous, loose rock sliding beneath the horse's hooves. Halfway up, Caroline insisted on dismounting and walking, arguing that the horse could not safely carry both of them on the steepest sections without risking a fatal fall. Takelma wanted to refuse, wanted to spare her the ordeal, but he could see the logic in her argument. He helped her down and led the horse, while Caroline picked her way up the trail behind him, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the other gripping rocks and branches for balance. Every few minutes, she had to stop bent over with cramping pain before forcing herself to continue. They were within sight of the dam, and when two riders appeared on the canyon rim, rifles glinting in the harsh sunlight. The shots came almost immediately, bullets kicking up dust and rock chips around their feet. Takelma yanked Caroline behind a large boulder and returned fire, forcing the riders to seek cover. But he knew more men would be coming, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They reached the dam under sporadic fire, and Takelma studied the crude structure while Caroline pressed herself against the canyon wall, trying to catch her breath. The dam was more substantial than he had hoped, rocks and timber lashed together with rope and sealed with packed mud and clay. Destroying it entirely would require more explosives than he had. But he did not need to destroy it, just damage it enough to let water through. He pulled a small bundle of dynamite from his saddlebag, 4 sticks he had traded for months ago and saved for an emergency. He positioned them carefully in a crack in the rocks at the base of the dam, then lit the fuse with trembling fingers. "Get behind the rock," he shouted to Caroline. "Cover your head and hold on to something solid." He hauled her behind the largest boulder he could find and threw his body over hers, shielding her from the coming blast. The dynamite exploded with a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The concussion wave washed over them, stealing the air from their lungs. Debris rained down rocks, splinters of wood, clods of mud. Then came the water. The dam had not been destroyed, but a section of the upper wall had been breached. Water came pouring through the gap in a powerful surge, cold and shocking. It hit them waist deep, nearly washing Takelma off his feet. He locked his arms around the boulder, with Caroline trapped between him and the stone, refusing to let go, even as the current tore at his legs and tried to drag them both away. Caroline clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, one arm wrapped protectively around her belly. She could feel the baby moving frantically, disturbed by the violence and the cold water. The surge lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then began to subside as the water found new channels and spread out down the canyon. Takelma pulled Caroline away from the rock and checked her for injuries. She was soaked and shaking, her dress plastered to her body, but she was alive. The baby kicked hard against his hand when he touched her belly, and he felt a rush of relief so intense it left him dizzy. "We need to move," he said. "They will be coming." They started back down the trail, moving as quickly as Caroline's condition allowed. Water ran freely now, cascading down the canyon and spreading across the valley below. The spring at Indian Gulch would flow again, at least for a while, until Kraus sent men to repair the dam. They were halfway down when they found the trail blocked. Nidus stood there with 6 Apache men, all armed, all furious. The confrontation was raw and immediate. Nidus stepped forward, his face twisted with rage, barely held in check. "You have gone too far, cousin," Nidus said, his voice shaking. "You have brought war to our doorstep for the sake of a white woman. Kraus's men are already moving against our camps, accusing us of harboring fugitives and sabotaging his property. Children are going hungry because we have to keep moving. Old people are dying because we cannot stay in one place long enough for them to rest. All because of her." He pointed at Caroline, and she saw genuine hatred in his eyes. "She is not worth it. She is not worth one Apache life, let alone all the suffering you have brought down on us. Then what would you have me do? Takelma demanded. Should I have let them kill her in the street? Should I stand aside while men like Kraus destroy everything good and decent in the name of profit and power? Is that what we have become? Is that what you want our children to learn, that it is acceptable to look away when the strong prey on the weak? Our children are going hungry now, one of the other men said. Your principles will not fill their bellies. The argument grew more heated, voices rising, hands moving toward weapons. Caroline could feel the violence hovering just beneath the surface, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. And then her foot slipped on the wet rock. She did not scream, there was no time. One moment she was standing on the trail, the next she was sliding toward the edge, toward a drop of 15 feet onto jagged rocks below. Her hands scrabbled for purchase, finding nothing. Time seemed to slow, and she saw her death with perfect clarity. Two hands grabbed her simultaneously, Takelma catching her wrist, Nitis grabbing the fabric of her skirt. Together, they hauled her back onto the trail. The combined strength of both men saving her from a fall that would have killed her and the baby both. Caroline collapsed onto the ground, gasping, one hand pressed protectively over her belly. The baby kicked frantically, and she felt a warm wetness between her legs that might have been water from the creek or might have been the first sign of labor beginning. For a long moment, no one spoke. Nitis still held the torn fabric of her dress in his hand, staring at it as if he could not quite comprehend what had just happened. Then he looked at Takelma, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement of shared blood and shared instinct. I still think you are a fool, Nitis said quietly. But perhaps you are a fool with honor. That is worth something even if it gets us all killed. He released the torn fabric and stepped back. I will watch the canyon rim. If Kraus's men come in force, I will send word. But that is all I can offer you. Do not ask for more. My first duty is to my people, and they have suffered enough for your choices. I understand, Takelma said. And thank you. For everything. Nitis nodded once, and then turned and walked away, his men following. Caroline struggled to her feet with Takelma's help, and they continued down the trail. By the time they reached the cabin, Caroline was bent over with pain contractions coming regularly now, and Takelma knew with certainty that the baby would come soon, ready or not, safe or not. That night, as Caroline tried to rest between increasingly frequent contractions, Takelma stood on the porch and looked out at the prairie. The sunset was spectacular, the sky painted in shades of orange and gold and deep crimson, the cliffs glowing as if lit from within. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder that the world did not care about their struggles, would continue turning with or without them. He heard Caroline cry out inside, heard her struggling to breathe through the pain. He wanted to go to her to offer what comfort he could, but he also needed to keep watch. Kraus would be coming soon. The only question was when. The evening came on, hard and bright, the sun sinking toward the western horizon in a blaze of fire. The light bathed the porch of the cabin, turning the rough-hewn logs into something almost beautiful. Caroline stood gripping the post Takelma had secured for her, her belly heavy and low, feeling the baby, shifting restlessly inside her. Wind tugged at her hair, pulling loose strands from the braids she had woven that morning with trembling fingers. Takelma stepped beside her, dressed in his fringed buckskin shirt and beaded headband, and automatically slid his arm around her shoulders to steady her. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence, and together they looked out across the prairie. On the distant horizon, dust plumes rose. Riders were coming more than before, and Caroline felt her heart sink into her belly. They are coming to finish this, she said quietly. Yes, Takelma replied, his voice calm despite the tension she could feel in his body. They are. Are we going to die? Takelma did not answer immediately. He looked at her, at the curve of her belly where their child waited to be born, at the fierce determination in her eyes, despite her fear. He had spent 3 years preparing to die, expecting it, almost welcoming it as an escape from his grief. But now standing here with this woman, who had somehow become his reason to keep living, he found that he was not ready to surrender. "Not if I can prevent it," he said finally. "Not without making them pay dearly for every inch of ground they take." Caroline nodded, and they stood together, watching the riders approach. The dust cloud grew larger, and soon she could make out individual figures, perhaps 20 men, maybe more, all armed. The siege begins. Rudolf Kraus arrived at the head of a small army, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his face flushed with triumph. He believed he had already won, that the sheer number of men at his back would force Takelma to surrender without a fight. Sheriff Matteo Conti rode beside him, but Matteo's face was drawn and troubled, as if he were riding toward something he knew was wrong, but felt powerless to stop. The riders spread out around the cabin in a loose semicircle, cutting off any avenue of escape. Matteo dismounted and walked forward slowly, a long sheet of paper in his hand. His eyes met Takelma's, and for a moment something passed between them, respect perhaps, or regret for what was about to happen. "This is an official eviction order," Matteo said, his voice flat and tired. "Signed by Judge Warren Blackwood and authorized by the Territorial Land Office. Indian Gulch has been transferred to Mr. Rudolf Kraus for development purposes related to the proposed railway expansion. You are ordered to vacate these premises immediately. Any resistance will be met with lawful force." He paused and then added in a lower voice, "I rode out here earlier today to warn you to give you time to leave peacefully. But Kraus was already mobilizing his men. I am sorry, Takelma. I truly am." Rudolf Kraus urged his horse forward, his face twisted with satisfaction. "Your time is up, Indian. Get off my land and bring the woman with you. She has a debt to pay, and I intend to see it settled one way or another." He gestured sharply to his men, and 2 of them dismounted and moved toward the porch. One of them, the same scarred man who had confronted Takelma days earlier, grabbed Caroline's arm roughly and tried to pull her toward the wagon. His fingers dug into her flesh, hard enough to bruise. Pain ripped through Caroline's abdomen, sudden and vicious, unlike anything she had felt before. Her water broke in a rush, soaking her dress and the boards beneath her feet. Her legs buckled. She screamed, the sound raw and primal, torn from someplace deep inside her where terror and agony met and merged. Takelma caught her before she could fall, his arms going around her to support her weight. Inside the cabin, Dr. Joseph Hale, who had arrived earlier that day to check on Caroline and had stayed when he sensed trouble coming, rushed to the door. "The baby is coming," Joseph shouted, his voice sharp with alarm. "She cannot be moved. If you try to transport her now, you will kill her and the child both." Another contraction seized Caroline, and she doubled over in Takelma's arms, gasping for air. Blood mixed with the fluid on the porch boards, and Joseph's face went pale. "She is hemorrhaging," he said. "We need to get her inside immediately." Takelma did not hesitate. He shifted Caroline's weight, pulled the coach gun from its pegs with his free hand, and fired both barrels over the heads of the men in the yard. The blast was deafening, the shot ripping through the air and sending men diving for cover. Horses reared and screamed. Before anyone could react, Takelma kicked the door wider, carried Caroline inside, and dropped the heavy oak bar across the entrance. He shoved the table against the door for added measure, then turned to help Joseph get Caroline onto the bed. Outside, Rudolf Kraus bellowed orders, his voice hoarse with fury. "You are a dead man, Indian. You hear me. You are dead, and so is that whore you are protecting. Men took up positions around the cabin, using the corn patch, the garden fence, and the rocks for cover. The first volley of shots punched through the log walls, sending splinters flying through the interior. One bullet passed so close to Joseph that it tore through his coat sleeve, and he yelped and dropped to the floor. "How long until the baby comes?" Takelma demanded, crouched beside the bed and reloading the coach gun with practiced speed. Joseph pressed his hands to Caroline's belly, feeling the position of the child, and his face darkened with concern. "I do not know. The baby is breech feet first instead of head first. I need to try to turn it, but that will take time, and she needs to be as calm as possible." Which is impossible with bullets flying through the walls. More shots rang out, and a lantern hanging from the rafters shattered, spilling oil across the floor. Takelma stamped it out before it could catch fire, then returned to the window. He could see men maneuvering closer, using the cover of the corn to advance on the cabin. Lisette Moreau, who had accompanied Joseph to act as witness to any legal proceedings, and who now found herself trapped in the middle of a firefight, tore strips from her petticoat to use as bandages. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady as she knelt beside Caroline and began speaking softly in French, trying to keep her calm. "Breathe, ma chérie," Lisette murmured, wiping Caroline's forehead with a damp cloth. "Just breathe. You are strong. You have survived so much already. You can survive this too." Caroline clamped her teeth on a leather strap Joseph had given her, trying to muffle her screams as Joseph worked to turn the baby. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined, a tearing, ripping agony that made her feel as if her body were being split apart from the inside. Every contraction was a wave that threatened to drown her, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each one. Outside, Rudolf Krauss had lost patience. He ordered his men to stack brush and dried corn stalks along the upwind wall of the cabin. His intention was to smoke them out, force them to surrender or suffocate. But the prairie wind was rising, gusting unpredictably. When they lit the pile, the flames caught faster than expected, fanned by the wind into something far more dangerous than smoke. Inside the cabin, smoke began filtering through the chinks between the logs, thick and choking. Caroline coughed violently between contractions, her already labored breathing becoming even more desperate. Joseph worked frantically, his hands inside her body, trying to manipulate the baby into the correct position. "I almost have it," he muttered, sweat streaming down his face. "Just a little more." Outside, Rudolph kicked at a lantern in frustration, and it skidded across the porch, shattering against a post. Oil spilled and ignited, instantly, flames racing along the dry wood. What had been intended as a smokeout transformed in seconds into a genuine inferno. "The cabin is on fire," one of Krauss's men shouted, and there was genuine alarm in his voice now. No one had intended to burn a woman and child alive. Even these hardened men drew the line somewhere. But the fire had its own momentum now, fed by dry timber and prairie wind. Flames licked up the front wall and began spreading toward the roof. Takelma saw the fire through the window and knew they had minutes at most before the cabin became an oven that would cook them alive. He thrust the coach gun into Lisette's trembling hands. "If anyone tries to come through that door, you pull both triggers," he said, his voice hard. "Do not hesitate. Do not think. Just shoot." Then he threw a wet cloth over his face, took a deep breath of the increasingly foul air, and kicked open the door just wide enough to squeeze through. He charged out onto the blazing porch, smoke searing his lungs, cinders raining down on his bare arms and face. Rifle fire cracked from multiple positions, bullets whipping through the smoke. One grazed his left thigh, tearing through muscle and leaving a burning trail of pain. Another splintered a porch post inches from his head, showering him with splinters that stuck in his skin like tiny daggers. But he did not stop. He kicked at the burning planks, trying to separate them from the wall. He hacked at them with his hatchet, his movements growing more desperate as the heat intensified. He used his own body to shove burning timber off the edge of the porch, feeling his skin blister and char, but refusing to retreat. If Caroline and the baby died in this fire, it would be because he had failed to save them, and that thought was more unbearable than any physical pain. Inside the cabin, Joseph finally succeeded in turning the baby. He pulled his hands free, slick with blood, and locked eyes with Caroline. "Now," he said urgently. "You have to push now, Caroline. One more time. You can do this. Push." Caroline gathered every last shred of strength she possessed and pushed. She felt something tear deep inside her, a ripping sensation, followed by a gush of blood. She screamed, the sound ripping from her throat despite the leather strap between her teeth. And then suddenly, blessedly, she felt the baby slide free. Joseph caught the child in his hands, a tiny, slippery form that lay ominously still. For one horrible second, there was only the roar of flames and the crack of gunfire. The baby did not move, did not cry. Joseph turned the infant over, quickly cleared its mouth with one finger, and rubbed its back hard. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on, little one. Breathe." Nothing. The baby remained limp and silent. Joseph struck it sharply between the shoulder blades, harder than he wanted to, but desperate now. And finally, a thin, angry wail cut through the chaos. The baby was alive. Caroline sobbed with relief, so intense it felt like another kind of pain. Joseph wrapped the child in a torn piece of Caroline's dress and placed it on her chest. "A girl," he said, his voice hoarse. "You have a daughter." Caroline looked down at the tiny wrinkled face, at the dark eyes that were just beginning to focus, and felt something shift inside her. Despite everything, the fire, the bullets, the pain, her daughter was alive. That was all that mattered. Outside, the battle had reached a critical point. From the ridgeline above the cabin, Nidus and his Apache warriors finally revealed themselves. They had been watching, waiting, trying to stay out of the conflict. But when they saw the cabin burning with Caroline and the baby inside, something in Nidus shifted. Whatever his anger at Takelma, whatever his resentment of the white woman, he could not stand by and watch a child burn to death. The Apache rifles spoke with sharp precision, picking off men who got too close to the burning structure. The shots came from unexpected angles, sowing confusion among Krause's men, and forcing them to split their attention between the cabin and the unseen shooters on the rim. Sheriff Matteo Conti had been struggling with his conscience since the moment the first shot was fired. He had come here to enforce the law, not to participate in murder. When he saw Rudolf Krause raise his revolver and aim it at a gap in the cabin wall, intending to fire blindly into the interior, where Caroline and the baby lay helpless, something inside him snapped. He spurred his horse directly between Krause and the cabin. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "This has gone far enough. I have the ledger, Krause. I have proof of what you and the judge have been doing, the trade in women, the fraud, all of it. This woman is a victim, not a criminal, and I will not let you murder her." Rudolf Krause swung his gun toward Matteo, his face purple with rage. "You traitorous coward, you have always been weak, Conti. That is why you will never be more than a small-town lawman." "Perhaps," Matteo said. "But I can live with that. Can you?" He fired first the bullet, taking Krause in the shoulder and spinning him around. Krause's wild return shot went high and wide, smashing another lantern hanging from the porch overhang. Burning oil splashed across a corner of the roof, and flames began eating through the shingles. Takelma saw the roof catch and knew they were out of time. He had done everything he could to save the front wall, but now the entire structure was burning. They had to get out. He stumbled back through the door, his arms covered with burns, blood streaming from the wound in his thigh, and found Caroline sitting up in bed with the baby in her arms. "We have to leave," he said. "Now." Joseph helped Caroline to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed. She was weak from blood loss and the ordeal of childbirth, but she clutched the baby to her chest and forced herself to move. Lisette threw a blanket over Caroline's shoulders, then grabbed Joseph's medical bag. They stumbled out into the yard where the gunfire had mostly stopped. Krause's men were backing away from the burning cabin, uncertain what to do now that their leader was wounded and the sheriff had turned against them. On the ridgeline, Nidus and his warriors held their positions, rifles trained on anyone who looked like they might resume the fight. But the cost had been high. One young Apache warrior lay dead on the slope, his body covered with a blanket. Two of Krause's men were down as well, one clearly dead, and the other groaning with a belly wound that would likely kill him within hours. The cabin burned behind them, flames roaring up into the darkening sky, 3 years of Tekelma's life and labor, turning to ash and smoke. Mateo dismounted and approached Tekelma slowly, hands clearly visible. "It is over," he said quietly. "I am placing Rudolf Krause under arrest for fraud, the trade in women, and attempted murder. Judge Blackwood as well once I get back to town. You and the woman are free to go." Tekelma swayed on his feet, pain and exhaustion threatening to drag him down. "What about the eviction order?" "Void," Mateo said. "It was issued under false pretenses by a corrupt judge as part of a criminal enterprise. The territorial governor will have to sort out the land rights properly, but I will testify on your behalf. Both of you." He looked at Caroline, who stood holding her newborn daughter, her dress soaked with blood, and fluid, her face pale as death, but her eyes fierce. "You and the child need medical attention. Dr. Hale, can you?" "I will see to them," Joseph said. "But we cannot stay here. The cabin is lost, and Mrs. Meyer needs rest and shelter." "Take them to my house," Mateo said. "My wife will help. I will deal with this mess and meet you there." As dawn broke over the prairie, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the survivors sorted themselves out. Rudolf Krause was bound and placed in a wagon, his face gray with pain and shock. His men leaderless and suddenly aware of the magnitude of what they had participated in, dispersed, quietly wanting no part of what was to come. Caroline sat on the ground, wrapped in blankets, the baby at her breast, and watched the cabin burn. She had lost her temporary shelter, but she had gained something far more precious. Tekelma sat beside her, his burns bandaged by Joseph's practiced hands, his leg wound bound tightly to stop the bleeding. He looked at the ruins of his home and felt nothing. No grief, no anger, just a strange sense of relief that it was finally over. "What will you do now?" Caroline asked softly. "I do not know," Tekelma admitted. "But we will figure it out. Together." Caroline reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining. "Together," she agreed. On the ridge above, Nidus stood watching them. He had lost a young warrior, a boy he had watched grow from infancy, and the weight of that death sat heavy on his shoulders. But he had also helped prevent a greater injustice, and perhaps that counted for something. He turned away and led his people back into the hills, carrying their fallen comrade to be buried according to Apache tradition. Weeks later, autumn transformed the prairie. The oppressive heat broke, replaced by cooler days and crisp nights that made sleep possible again. The burned remains of Tekelma's cabin were cleared away, and with the help of several Apache families and a few sympathetic homesteaders from the valley, a new structure began to rise in its place. Larger, sturdier, with proper windows and a stone fireplace. The diversion dam in Whirlwind Pass was dismantled by order of the territorial court, and water flowed freely again through Indian Gulch and into the downstream canyons where Apache camps relied on it for survival. The judge, Warren Blackwood, was removed from office and arrested. His trial became a sensation in the territorial newspapers, exposing not just the trade in women, but a broader web of corruption that had infected land claims and legal proceedings throughout the region. With Lisette Moreau translating the complex legal language, and Joseph Hale providing testimony and documentation, Caroline filed for a homestead claim on the land where the new cabin was being built. The claim was filed in her name alone, a single woman with a child, as federal homestead law explicitly allowed. Takelma appeared on the documents only as her hired hand and guardian, listed in a carefully worded side note as residing on premises as foreman protector and essential to the successful operation of the homestead. It was a legal fiction, a way to navigate laws that would never allow an Apache man to hold title beside a white woman. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. He was her partner in every sense that counted, the child's father in all the ways that love and commitment could define fatherhood, even if no court would ever formally recognize it. Sheriff Mateo Conti, who had resigned his position rather than continue enforcing laws he now recognized as fundamentally unjust, personally escorted the homestead paperwork to the territorial capital. He carried with him a deposition exposing the full scope of Krause's criminal enterprise and the judge's complicity. The governor's office, embarrassed by the scandal and eager to demonstrate decisive action, issued a public proclamation. The statement named Carolyn Meyer's testimony and Takelma's actions as instrumental in breaking the trade in women. It noted that if any official ever attempted to remove Mrs. Meyer or her dependents from the homestead at Indian Gulch, they would need to explain why they were undoing land granted to a woman who had survived documented fraud and whose defender had been publicly commended for his courage. When Mateo returned with the sealed homestead deed and the governor's proclamation, he found Caroline standing on the porch of the new cabin, the baby asleep in a sling against her chest. Takelma stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, watching the construction crew finish the roof. "It is done," Mateo said, handing Caroline the documents. "The land is yours legally and permanently. And just so you know, Krause and the judge both face trial next month. The territorial attorney general is pushing for the maximum penalties. They will both likely hang." Caroline took the papers with shaking hands, staring at the official seals and signatures that transformed her from fugitive to landowner in the stroke of a pen. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For choosing the right thing, even when it cost you." Mateo shrugged uncomfortably. "I should have chosen it sooner. Should have questioned those contracts from the beginning. But I was too concerned with following rules I did not stop to think about whether the rules themselves were just. I will not make that mistake again." He tipped his hat to Takelma, offered a genuine smile to Caroline, and rode away. Takelma and Caroline stood together on the porch, watching him disappear into the distance. "It still does not feel real," Caroline said. "That we survived. That the baby is safe. That this land is actually ours." "It is real," Takelma assured her. "Though I suspect we will face other challenges. The law may be on our side now, but that does not mean everyone will accept us. There will be people who resent an Apache living on deeded land, who resent a white woman choosing him over one of them. Let them resent," Caroline said fiercely. "We have faced worse and survived." Over the following months, the story of their ordeal spread beyond the territory. Newspaper articles appeared in eastern cities romanticizing some elements, sensationalizing others, but ultimately bringing attention to the practice of mail-order bride fraud. Several other women who had been trapped in similar situations came forward, and men sent from the capital began asking questions of judges and sheriffs all across the territory. Lisette Moreau became something of a local hero for her role in exposing the ledger. She received offers to teach at larger, more prestigious schools, but she chose to stay in the region, opening a small school for the children of Apache families and mixed homesteads. She never married, pouring her considerable energy and intelligence into education and advocacy. Joseph Hale's practice flourished as word spread of his role in saving Caroline and the baby during the siege. He became the preferred doctor for many of the Apache families in the area, one of the few white men they truly trusted. He never became wealthy. He treated too many patients who could not pay. But he died years later, satisfied that he had lived a meaningful life. One evening, as the sun set behind the cliffs in a blaze of orange and gold, Takelma and Caroline stood together on the porch of their completed cabin. The baby, named Alona, meaning oak tree in Apache, strong and rooted, slept peacefully in a cradle Nidus had carved as a gift. The valley stretched out before them, golden grass waving in the wind, the spring running clear and strong. Takelma pointed toward a stand of cottonwoods by the river. In spring, we can plant apple trees there. Maybe peach as well. The soil is good near the water. Caroline listened, noticing how he always said "we" now, when talking about the future, as if their lives had become so intertwined that it was impossible to imagine them separately. She leaned into him, and his arm tightened around her shoulders. "I want to tell you something," Caroline said softly. "Something I have been thinking about since Alona was born." "What is it?" "When I was on that ship from Germany, crowded in the dark, with women who spoke different languages, many of us sick, some dying, I used to think that I had made a terrible mistake. That I should have stayed in Germany, married the butcher's son, lived a small, safe life. But now looking at this," she gestured at the cabin, the land, the sleeping child, "I realized that every terrible thing that happened, every frightening moment, every time I thought I would die, all of it led me here, to you, to our daughter, to this place. And I would do it all again, suffer it all again to end up here." Takelma was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "For 3 years after Nietzsche died, I was not really living. I was just existing, going through motions, waiting for something that I could not name. I thought it was revenge I wanted, or justice. But it was not. It was this. It was you. A reason to keep going that was stronger than my grief." He turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. "I know what we have is not recognized by the law, not in the way it should be. I know that on paper you are a homesteader, and I am just your hired hand. But in every way that matters, you are my wife, and Alona is my daughter. That is the truth, regardless of what any document says." Tears streamed down Caroline's face. "Then let us make our own ceremony. Not a legal one, but something that is ours. Something that recognizes what we are to each other." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, and Takelma spoke words in Apache that Caroline was slowly learning to understand, words about partnership and protection, about building something together that would outlast them both. Caroline responded with words in English and German about love that was earned through hardship, about choosing each other every day, through deliberate action rather than hollow promises. When they finished, they stood in silence as the stars began to emerge one by one until the sky was filled with light. Far to the south, Rudolph Krauss and Judge Warren Blackwood stood trial and were convicted on multiple counts. Both were sentenced to death by hanging. On the morning of their execution, a small crowd gathered to watch, including several of the women who had been rescued from the trade in women. Justice, delayed and imperfect as it was, had finally arrived. In the valley, life settled into new patterns. Apache families and white homesteaders, who had previously been at odds, began to find common ground, brought together by shared water resources and the recognition that cooperation served them better than conflict. It was not perfect. Old prejudices and suspicions died hard, but it was progress. Nidus came to visit on a cold winter morning, bringing with him a bundle of furs and dried meat. He stood awkwardly in the cabin, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to make the gesture. Caroline served him coffee, and they sat around the table while Alona played on a blanket near the fire. "She is strong," Nidus said, nodding toward the baby. "She will grow up knowing both worlds. That will make her stronger than either of us." "I hope so," Takelma said. "The world she inherits will need strong women." Nidus was quiet for a moment, then said, "I lost Dakota in that fight. He was young, full of promise. I have been angry about that. Angry at you for bringing this trouble to us." "I know," Takelma said, "and I am sorry. But," Nidus continued, "I have been thinking. Dakota died protecting what was right. He died standing against injustice. That is not a meaningless death. That is the death of a warrior. And perhaps that is worth something." The two men sat in silence, the old bond between them, mending slowly, scarred, but not broken. When Nidus left, he embraced his cousin, and both men understood that while the past could not be erased, it could be honored and learned from. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the promise of new growth. Takelma and Caroline planted apple trees by the river, along with peach and plum. They expanded the garden, adding squash and beans to complement the corn. They built a larger chicken coop and acquired a milk cow from a neighboring homesteader. One afternoon, as Caroline hung laundry on a line strung between the cabin and a cottonwood tree, she saw a woman approaching on foot, leading a tired horse. The woman was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair and haunted eyes. She stopped at the edge of the yard, clearly frightened. "Are you Caroline Meyer?" the woman asked in heavily accented English. "Yes," Caroline said, setting down her laundry basket. "Who are you?" "My name is Greta. I was one of the names in that ledger. They sent me to work at a mine, but I escaped. Someone in town told me that you might help me, that you would understand." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. She walked forward and embraced the stranger, feeling Greta collapse against her with relief. "You are safe now. Come inside. We will find you food and a place to rest, and then we will figure out what comes next." Over the following months, other women found their way to the cabin at Indian Gulch. Some stayed only briefly before moving on to build their own lives. Others stayed longer, helping with the work's learning skills, regaining strength. Caroline and Takelma never turned anyone away. The cabin gained a reputation as a safe haven, a place where those who had been cast aside by society could find refuge and rebuild. It was not always easy. Resources were stretched thin at times, and some of the women carried traumas that made them difficult to help. But Caroline refused to stop. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to stand alone in that dusty street with a gun pointed at her belly. On a warm summer evening 2 years after Alona's birth, Takelma and Caroline sat on the porch watching their daughter take her first unsteady steps across the yard. The child tottered and fell, then picked herself up and tried again, determined and fearless. "She has your stubbornness," Takelma observed with a smile. "And your courage," Caroline replied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. The land stretched out before them, marked now with apple trees and cultivated fields with neighbors both Apache and white, who had learned that survival depended on cooperation rather than conflict. "Do you ever regret it?" Takelma asked quietly. "Taking me in when I was a stranger, risking everything for someone you did not know?" "Never," Caroline said immediately. "Not for a single moment. You gave me something more precious than safety or shelter. You gave me a future worth fighting for. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. You gave me Alona. You gave me this life." She reached over and took his hand. "The Apache warrior took me in when everyone else turned away, and I gave him a family I never thought I would have." Takelma finished. "You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive. You gave me back my heart when I thought it had died with Nietzsche. You gave me everything." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, their daughter playing in the dust at their feet, the land they had fought so hard to keep stretching out around them in quiet beauty. They had faced death and injustice, and a world that did not want them to exist together. But they had survived, and more than survived, they had built something good and lasting. Years later, when Alona was old enough to understand, they would tell her the full story of her birth, how she had been born in fire and gun smoke, how her parents had defied the law and society and death itself to give her a chance at life. They would teach her that love was not about grand gestures or romantic words, but about standing beside someone when the world demanded you abandon them. And Alona would grow up strong and rooted like the oak tree she was named for, drawing strength from both her Apache father and her German mother, belonging fully to neither world, but creating her own in the space between. The sun disappeared behind the western cliffs, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Takelma and Caroline stood and walked inside together, Alona between them, her small hands gripping theirs. Behind them, the land settled into the quiet of evening, holding their story in its soil and stone. A testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories are not won with weapons, but with a simple, stubborn refusal to give up on the people we love.